I'll start then, Sudipta. Um, Welcome to Oshe Conversations. It gives me great pleasure this morning to introduce Pradip Krishen, who has very gladly accepted our invitation to speak today. Yesterday, Pradeep spoke to me over the phone and suggested that rather than him showing a PowerPoint, as has become the norm of pretty pictures, he called it, he would rather that there was an engagement between us and him through a series of question and answers. So the format today is going to be one where we will put some questions. As you all know, yesterday I posted this and I have collected the questions and we will start with that. But before that, a little bit about Pradip, who is a filmmaker, an environmentalist, tree lover, and has been called an ecological gardener as well. His films, Masi Sahab, was a classic from 1985, and in which Annie Gives It Those Ones of 1989 was a cult one, and which most of us architects saw because it was about us or people like us at the School of Planning and Architecture. I remember the screening of it in about 1993, I think, at the Sept Film Club. And we all felt this kind of euphoria that finally people like us had been represented on the big screen. He went on to make one more film, Electric Moon, for Channel 4, BBC. And then in 1995 made a shift to an interest in environment. He started off by studying trees, and I think it's common amongst several of our speakers that walking plays a large part in the way that their interest develops. And he spent time walking the jungles of Panchmari in Madhya Pradesh and teaching himself botany, and came back to Delhi to identify and document the trees of the city. In the course of his work, he organized what became very well known and were the Sunday morning tree walks, which also shared his interest with a larger public. I remember people in Bombay talking about these walks and how if one happened to be in Delhi on a Sunday morning, one must join this. He has subsequently been called an ecological gardener and has created several native plant gardens in Delhi. He has worked with the Aga Khan Trust on an eco initiative for the Sundar Nursery and the Aba Mahal in the Nagaur Fort. He was the director of gardens for the Calico Museum Gardens, and since 2015 has been rewilding the Rao Jodha Desert Park near Mehrangarh in Jodhpur. He presently, yes, sorry.
2005, not 15.
2005, sorry about that. He presently is also leading a team of horticulturalists and landscape architects in restoring sand dunes near Jaipur. He is the author of two exceptional books, The Trees of Delhi, A Field Guide, and Jungle Trees of Central India. Pradip, thank you for joining us and supporting this initiative at Oshe Studios, and particularly for the Oshe Conversation time.
Thank you very much.
Pradip, if I can start the question answer format, which you've kind of asked for, and I think we all thought it was a wonderful idea because it prevents the presentation from becoming pure consumption and demands a preparation and a kind of engagement more than just watching slides. So thank you for that. I just wanted to ask you, maybe slightly on a personal note, how the shift from filmmaking to environment and the interest in that really germinated, and how you moved from the studio, so to say, to the forests of Panchmari.
It's actually not such an interesting story, but basically in 1994, I realized that all the possible sources of funding for another film now lay either with people like the NFDC or Doordarshan, and I wouldn't want to work with them again after I'd had that experience. Or the option was going to Bombay with folded hands and saying, look, I'm really sorry for having made the kind of films that I made. Forgive me, I will now make, the kind of ridiculous films that you guys make. And I wasn't willing to do that. So it just seemed very clear that I had to find something else to do. And I then, I had bought a tiny piece of land in Pachmadi in the jungle, about 7 kilometers out of town. And I started building that with an architect friend of mine, with whom I've done lots of work subsequently. And fondly called it my midlife crisis because I didn't know what to do with myself. And for a while, I imagined that I would somehow try and live, a very simple life in the jungle, try and tempt Arundhati to join me there occasionally and my children. And the first project we tried to do was to design a natural history museum in Pachmadi that had been created in Captain Fawcett's bungalow called the Bison Lodge many, many years before. And we were paid, me and my architect friend Golak were paid, I think 12,000 rupees in all, for both of us, for working for 3 or 4 months. And this was with a government department called EPCO in Bhopal. And they loved the idea. They were very keen to do it. And then the Director General of EPCO was replaced, and the new guy arrived and chucked the file onto the highest shelf that he could find, and it was never seen again. So it was very clear to me that, look, this was just not going to work. But so I was walking. I had a forester neighbor, and he used to do what we called Latin walks, where he would, walk with us to the jungle, and he'd say, "Do you know what that's called?" And I'd say, "Batao." He'd say, "Usko soimida febrifuga bolte." So we say, "Really?" And I'd try and make a mental note of it. And then you slowly learn to look at the characters of trees and understand how to sort them. And both Golak and myself, we said, look, let's not look at everything because it's too large, but let's just look at trees. Let's not look at lianas and climbers and shrubs and grasses. Let's just look at trees. And let's learn to understand how a flora describes these things. So I think the first flora I bought was Dietrich Brandis's book about the Central India, and a lot of it was gobbledygook to me because there's all this botanical stuff that is you really need to go to a glossary and understand and take the time to internalize the meanings of some of these words. But slowly it became a great hobby for us because we walked a lot. We loved the jungle, and it probably seeped into me without my really knowing it, but I became more and more familiar with. Pachmadi probably has something like 110 species of native wild trees. And we said, let's try and get there in a year. And we didn't get anywhere close to 110, but we probably got close to about 60 or so in 1 year of just familiarizing ourselves. But it was such a fun journey. It's a bit like bird watching, but luckily trees don't fly away. So, there was that. But to be able to look at trees and to understand their characters and to, and to touch them. I mean, for us, tactile, relationships became very important. And then I tried for about 2.5 years. I got involved with a development plan that had hatched at the sort of government level in Madhya Pradesh to make a development plan for Pachmadi. And I slowly got more and more fascinated by especially the ways in which modern methods of integrated conservation planning work and, using GPS and all that. And I realized that the way that they were planning to do it at the town and country planning level in Madhya Pradesh was just completely outmoded and rubbishy. So I came back to INTAC, I think in 1997 or 6 perhaps. And I said, look, can't we propose to the government of Madhya Pradesh that INTAC does the ecological plan for Pachmari and make it absolutely a model for how planning for this kind of an area should actually happen. Pachmari was a very small town. It had a population of 27,000 people, which is really minuscule in our context, right? It's not minuscule in Australia or in America, and there was so much that you could prevent from going down the tube still. And we did a presentation to the chief secretary, basically saying that INTAC could form a team, that I would be like a resource person, and that we would present all kinds of policy alternatives to the government through a steering committee and create a new plan. And we had a very enlightened chief secretary at the time, a man called Sharad Beher, who listened very interestedly. And you could see that all the other secretaries to government in the room were waiting to get their cue from him. If he liked it, they would say, "Haan, sab karenge isko." And if he didn't like it, they said, "Nahi, sahab, hum isko nahi karenge." And that's exactly what happened. He was very, very empathetic. He said, "Yes, by all means, let's do it." And he signed an agreement with INTAC that needed a couple of steps to become completely set in concrete. And then he went and retired 2 or 3 months later. And the same thing happened with the Bison Lodge plan. New secretary arrived, new chief secretary arrived, didn't know INTAC and wasn't keen to do it. Now, you must understand that these kinds of plans, these development plans, actually have immense scope for corruption. So government at this level is really not keen to have an outsider coming in and poking their noses where they shouldn't be doing so. But am I taking too long? Is this too long-winded? Yeah.
No, please continue.
I was working very closely with a remarkable gentleman called Dr. Ishwaras, who had been in the IS, had retired 4 or 5 years before, played a huge role in INTAC as the local convener. And I gained a lot from his experience and his way of understanding how government works. And we persisted, and we finally got the state government to commission us formally to make a plan. And then 1 month into doing this, suddenly they canceled the plan. And by which time we'd spent some money, we'd initiated some studies. And the option was, do you now get into an adversarial, confrontation with the government, or do you say, we thought there's no point in that. And the government had ordered that it was the Town and Country Planning Organization, which is the statutory planning body for the state of Madhya Pradesh, that they should actually make the plan. And we said, look, maybe the thing to do, since our real interest is to make a good plan for Pachmari, our interest is to go into the TC and P out, or however whatever the abbreviation is, and offer to share our data with them and to share our methodology with them and to try and make their plan a better plan. And we were quite surprised that they welcomed us and said, yes, we'd love to work with you. And then I said to them at some point, I said, have you made any kind of listing of objectives for each of the sectors of your plan? And they looked at me blankly as if this was a completely crazy idea to have objectives. And I said, well, how do you expect anybody to criticize the plan or to look at the plan with any kind of understanding unless you set very clear objectives for? And there were so many sectors. These kinds of plans look at every aspect of life, from tribal livelihoods to tourism to the state of roads to drinking water, everything. So they said, would you do it for us? And we were already sort of well on our way towards doing this, and we agreed to do it. So we spent, something like 2 weeks creating what we thought was a really comprehensive, interesting document that looked at each sector and also looked at the intersectoral conjunction, And they said, thank you very much. And a little while later, they said, we are going to invite you to be on the committee to hear objections to the plan, and we're going to publish next week. And I thought, well, that's very nice of them to do that. And next week, they published the document, and it was absolutely shocking. I remember feeling a surge of blood pressure because it was like skating on a thick layer of corruption and ignorance and stupidity. You know, it was just awful. And we were absolutely shocked that we wrote a document that was about 120 pages long that kind of x-rayed their plan and showed, you know, almost paragraph by paragraph how they were wrong in so many different respects. And then they said, when can you come for the first meeting to hear objections? And I said to them, I said, look, I'm actually traveling with my wife to Brazil because she's been invited to talk there. So let's do it anytime except these 4 days in whatever month it was. So of course they scheduled the meeting exactly within those 4 days. And as it happened, her trip got canceled. And so I turned up for the meeting. And there were these ashen-faced town and country planning people who said, you know, we thought we were scheduling it when he wasn't there. And then we fought the plan tooth and nail, you know, and finally had it rejected. But to cut a, you know, and then there's more of the story, but, you know, I think I'm getting into things that are drifting away from what we want to talk about. But to cut a long story short, I realized soon after that, you know, I'd spent about 4 years with nothing to show for it since I had walked away from cinema. And when I first came back to Delhi, I said, look, I want to do something small and doable, which means that something that didn't cost a lot of money, something that didn't need a huge crew, something that certainly didn't involve government, because I'd had 2 awful experiences with government. And I looked outside my gate and I said, my God, I've got a tree growing right in front of me, which I've been seeing every day for the last 17 years. And I have no idea what it is. And I've never even thought to ask. And I thought, why don't I just write a little booklet and use the, you know, the tree spotting experience that I've gained, and maybe a 30, 40 page book about the common trees of Delhi, because, you know, the truth is that the lowest common denominator of awareness and knowledge about trees in this country is abysmally low, especially in urban places. You know, this is not obviously true of people who live in the countryside. So that's how it began, Riaz. And then, of course, you know, it went on from there. And the more I, you know, the tree walks you mentioned, I wasn't doing them every Sunday by any means. I was doing them maybe 6 times a year. But I learned a lot from the tree walks, you know, because the tree walks taught me what people found difficult to distinguish, the things they found difficult to understand. I would sometimes need to go back to, you know, my botany books to understand myself, something that they'd asked me. So it was a great learning for me. But, you know, I spent, you know, I started this work in 1998 and I didn't publish till 2006. So there was a long bit of learning. I mean, enough to do 2 PhDs. I didn't do anything like a PhD, but it was, you know, there was a lot of learning along the way.
You know, Pradip, while we were speaking, you mentioned that there is a pattern of planting of trees in Delhi, and that this was something that was initiated by the British, and that there was a certain kind of flaw in the thinking that underlay this. Would you talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, sure. So when I started writing The Trees of Delhi, the bulk of it, of course, is a field guide, like describing a tree, and you're talking about its ecology and when things happen, the phenology of the tree and things like that. But the introduction was meant to be a kind of foray into Delhi and how things happened, and, you know, with regard to trees and things like that. And there's lots of interesting aspects to that. I mean, especially around 1857, when trees were almost declared enemies of the British Raj, because, you know, mutineers, so-called mutineers, had hidden behind trees and sniped at British soldiers. And lots of trees were cut for that reason. A 500-yard zone sort of to the east of the Red Fort was cleared, you know, to have a clear firing line in case anybody stormed the garrison in future. But I was also fascinated by what could have happened when the new capital was declared in 1911, and I went into the archives, and here, I had taught history to start with, so I had experience of working in the archives and being able to close your nose because the stink from the urinal was so powerful in the National Archives in Delhi. But I started looking at some of these documents, and I found that there was actually quite an interesting debate about what trees to plant. It begins actually with Lord Hardinge riding on the ridge in August of 1912, when you can imagine the ridge would have been verdant and very beautiful. And they're still pondering over the question of what to do about the situation of Government House, the Viceroy's house. And they thought of a place not on the Raisina Hill, but next to Raisina Hill. But the orientation of the Great Way, what we call Rajpath today, and in those days was in a southwest, northeast direction, and would have actually ended up near Jama Masjid, and would have involved the buying up of Paharganj at great expense, and the eviction of all the people who lived there. So there was not a good resolution to the search for the ideal place. And when Hardinge went on the ridge, he said, "Oh my God, why can't we use the highest eminence on the ridge to situate Government House? Because then we can have Government House on top with a red roof and a golden cupola and the Union Jack flying on top, and we will look down benignly on our subjects, and they will look up at us and say, Sarkar, and this will just be perfect." But the only thing that matters is, can we garden in such a way on the ridge that you get a Versailles-like effect? So what he does is that he writes to, well, first of all, he shoots off a letter to Lutyens, who is still traveling by ship back to England. In those days, it took many months to come and go. And he says, "Look, I'm going to summon my blue-eyed forester boy, a man called Peter Clutterbuck, who was the chief conservator of the United Provinces." And he says, "Clutterbuck, will you please come to Delhi and take a look at this place and give us your opinion about whether it can be afforested in an interesting way with nice trees and shrubs." So Clutterbuck comes here and produces a list. Now, by the time Clutterbuck comes here and makes a list, Lutyens has been here once or twice more. He has rejected out of hand Hardinge's idea that they should use the ridge. He's insistent on the idea of using Raisina, and they've swung around the axis of the Great Way so that it points towards the Yamuna and becomes almost an east-west axis. So that matter is resolved, but there's still the question of suitable trees. And Lutyens, you have to remember, doesn't know his trees from this region. He's somebody who, even in England, relied on people like Villiers Stewart and people like that, but didn't really know his trees of this region, and is relying on two gardeners called Locke and Grayson, who are the government arboriculturists and superintendents of horticulture in Delhi. And I managed to get hold of the list that they provided to Lutyens. And then there's Clutterbuck's list, which is then critiqued and talked about. And then other people are kibitzing. So there are other British officials who are writing in and saying, we actually think we should use the banyan, this wonderfully grand tree that I once shot a tiger under in, COD, stuff like that. It's very interesting. But if you look at the issues in their debate, they boil down to two or three things. One of the fundamental ideas that animates the choice of trees. See, when the Imperial Capital Committee creates its first document that talks about trees for the new capital, they establish one very interesting idea. They say, having a sea of trees is easy. Anybody can do that. But we don't want our new city to look like a cantonment. And they use the word cantonment almost with, like in a pejorative sense. They just don't just want a sea of trees. And they're very clear that we don't want common trees. We want trees that stand out. And we also want trees to fit the purpose and the actual scale of avenues that we're building. So a lot of the avenues in New Delhi, and this is still true today, basically have architectural features, archaeological features at the ends of them, right? And they wanted to see trees framing these features, and they looked at things like how high are these trees going to grow, how, and things like that. So they actually picked only 13 species of trees at that early stage, and then refined the list later. And it's a very interesting list, these first 13, because one thing that is evident is that they're not looking at Mughal. They're not looking at any of the trees that the Mughals seem to have planted along the Grand Trunk Road, for example, along their avenue. They didn't think of the shisham, they didn't think of the mango, they didn't think of the banyan. All of these trees were not part of the way they were thinking about it. And when you look at this list, you also realize that they're looking at trees that, the idea of evergreenness was also very much part of their thinking. When you look at the so-called evergreen trees that they brought in, trees like the Arjun and the Jamun, for example, and the Safed Siras, what you notice straight away is that, look, for somebody going into a dry, deciduous forest and looking around in the dry season for trees that still retain their leaves and look evergreen, these are obvious trees that you would see. But they should have noticed that these were evergreen because they only grow, they're riparian trees, they only grow along the banks of perennial streams. So to pick a tree because it's evergreen without considering the fact that the reason it's evergreen is that it's got, perennial source of water is a bit odd. So they brought these trees in on this, this this misunderstanding of the ecology of these trees, right? A tree like the Albizia procera, the Safed Siras, grows in swamps that occur in the sub-Himalayan region. Basically, rivers are coming down, they're losing momentum, they're flooding, and they're forming swamps. And in these swamps, which are perennially wet, the Safed Siras, the Albizia procera, is evergreen. It's 8 months bare in a place like Delhi. So you can see the problem in the way they were thinking. So this is essentially the mistake they made. Some of these trees did okay because essentially most of Lutyens Delhi is contiguous with a part of a kind of microhabitat that is called the Banga, basically the floodplain of the Yamuna. So wherever there was enough water, it was okay. Along Rajpath, for example, where the big jamuns are, because the lawns are watered so much to keep the grass alive, it helps the trees. But many of these trees behave deciduously, which is the natural way for a tree to behave in an ecology like Delhi, right? Do you want to ask a supplementary question, or should I? You're on mute.
Yeah. No. So apart from the planting strategy, there is also the story of the Vilayati Kikar and how that kind of infested infested Delhi. So would you talk a little bit about that and how that came about?
No, I'm very interested in that because Vilayati Kikar has dogged my heels for many years. But Vilayati Kikar, as far as I can understand, comes in around 1888 into India from some seeds from Kew Gardens. Because foresters are always interested in what it is possible to do in a degraded forest, in a forest that has become what they call a wasteland. So when you've got the rootstock that has actually disappeared, it's so degraded that even the rootstock is gone, they reach out for solutions to how to regreen an area. And this is probably what happened in the 1880s. And Prosopis juliflora mesquite had a reputation of being able to grow anywhere, of tolerating high salinity, of managing with very little water, with also managing with being waterlogged, which is a remarkable, ability to actually do both, and to even grow in rocky areas and in a whole variety of soils. So people's ears probably pricked up and said, this sounds interesting. This is basically the natural range of Prosopis tuliflora begins in Mexico and then goes all the way down to Chile, which is very, very weird also. To have such a huge, latitudinal range for any tree is remarkable. So it is an extraordinary tree. So they start using it in, for example, the great grasslands of the Bunny were planted up with Prosopis tuliflora, and Prosopis tuliflora destroyed the grasslands in a matter of 20 years. It was the biggest grassland in Asia at the time, and it just completely finished it off. It was used in Punjab as the new canal colonies were being opened up, and with some success. And when I've looked, I've looked at in great detail at the trees that they were planting on the ridge. They started planting up the ridge first with a small experimental plot of 26 acres in 1912, and slowly they ramped it up. And then the war intervened, and things like that happened. So they didn't actually get into their stride till about 1920, 21. But not one single species that they planted on the ridge experimentally was actually native to that particular kind of thin-soiled, dry, rocky habitat. And the minute they withdrew watering, these trees perished. So it was a peculiar kind of blind spot that in some senses we still have in the forest department, where they don't understand, they don't even reach for an ecological understanding of what trees want and what trees need. So the central ridge in Delhi is about, it used to be about 1,000 hectares. It's now about 860 hectares, still a sizable patch of land. So this presented a big problem to people, but in the very first set of plans that the British made for New Delhi, 1911 and thereafter, this was set aside as what they called an amenity forest. And what the British mean by an amenity forest is that it's a place where Bara Sahids will ride their horses, and it's really a horse riding kind of amenity, right? And because it lay next to the President's Bodyguard, the PBG, which was just basically divided by one major road from the Ridge Forest, it was patronized by the PBG. A big polo ground was created there. But it still had this problem of, it was clearly in very poor shape in 1911, and continued in poor shape because everything that they were trying to do in it, even though it was on a small scale, wasn't working. And then I only recently, about 5 or 6 years ago, came across a very interesting document where somebody who had actually worked with Musto, with Edward, whatever Musto's first name was. So Musto is the superintendent of horticulture and arboriculture in the Punjab, and he's brought to Delhi around 1917, I think, and then becomes a trusted ally of Lutyens in the period around 1919, 1920. And they're said to have breakfast together every morning in the little bungalow at Sunehri Bagh that has been allotted to Lutyens. And they plot the different species of trees that they're going to plant in different places. But this document that I found 5 years ago talks about the fact that on Sunday morning, Musto would arrive with 2 coolies and some crowbars and little saplings of Prosopis juliflora. And he'd look for little places where behind a rock there'd be a little pocket of earth. And he personally actually placed the seedling there and say, one day you will see that this will become a forest of this particular Vilaiti kikar. And that's exactly what happened, because what Vilaiti kikar does, of course, is it's extremely invasive. it secretes an alkaloid in its root zone that inhibits anything else from growing close to it. It outcompetes everything else by its own vitality and reproductive success. It flowers in fruit twice a year, and slowly, or perhaps even rapidly, it became a complete monoculture of Pradip Juliflora, to the extent that now I would say that 95 or 96% of the ridge, of the central ridge, is entirely this one species. But it's very interesting that when I take people walking on the ridge, there is, for some odd reason that I haven't quite analyzed yet, but there's a particular point on our walk where you get the last Pradip Juliflora tree, and then for the next, say, 200 yards or so, there's a complete absence of Pradip Juliflora, and then it starts again. It's just like one little break in the, in the pure canopy of Pradip Juliflora. And here suddenly you see some of the native flora, some of the native trees and bushes coming in, to the extent of about 25, 26 species of native trees that are completely absent from the rest of it. So this is a very clear demonstration of to what extent Pradip can actually suppress the rejuvenation or the coming back of native vegetation. So it's a pernicious tree. It's now there on such a large scale that it would be really difficult to get rid of it. But one of the things that interests me hugely, and this probably won't happen in my lifetime, but is the rejuvenation of the ridge to create, the largest and the best natural dry forest that any capital city in the world has. I think there's huge potential, but it needs the coming together of designers and ecologists and plant people and landscape architects in a way that has not happened anywhere in this country so far. So one is dreaming of of something that is in the future.
I think it seems that what you're saying is that there can be a bad greening that is, for a city. And I just wanted to ask you that when we plant in an urban context, are the trees and other fauna connected to a larger ecology, or by virtue of being cut off from larger ecological flows because of infrastructure and buildings, do they largely become ornamental? Is that possible? I mean, you can have, let's say, the large plantation of the ridge, as you've described, as a kind of park, a biodiversity park, or something of that scale. But when we are planting, let's say, along streets, along the roads, how does that kind of tie into larger ecological connections that the city makes with its environment? Yeah.
So, you have to think of fauna at different scales. If you think of insect life, if you think of butterflies, if you think of bees, if you think of littler things, then one single tree is like a biome for many of these things, right? So I remember seeing a film about the secret life of a city made about London, sometime in the 1970s, or perhaps in the early 1980s, and it was so fascinating to see that not just at the level of insects and birds and butterflies, but also at the level of things like foxes and bats and a whole lot of other things were all denizens of the city, and that the city can be more sensitive to them or less sensitive to them. If you drive along Janpat today, not that part of Janpat which is part of Connaught Place, but further south, it is a place where you see thousands of fruit bats of flying foxes actually roosting in the trees. So there's a lot of wildlife. There's a lot of wildlife that actually makes use of whatever opportunities there are in a city. I had the good fortune once of interacting with a very nice and receptive forester who had taken over as head of horticulture in the NDMC. And I said to him, would you think of growing hedges all along the various low walls that you get, in government bungalows in Lucknow and Delhi. Because there are all these low walls and they've now been made higher because people feel insecure. But they're hard-edged and they're not very pretty to look at. And I said, why don't we grow hedges? Not just because they will soften the hard edges of these places, but also because they become home for a whole range of creatures, from rodents to birds to insects to things like that. And it'll actually help the city. And I was very pleased to see that he started doing this. And it's actually been carried on by subsequent people, not always in the best possible way, but it actually has changed the way in which these bungalows look from the outside, from your view from the street. So, to answer your question, I mean, in places like the Ridge, it's a completely different story because you've got a much larger biome, right? That has been also emptied out of some of its wildlife. I mean, I once wrote an article because I found a whole lot of information about how the jackals were hunted out in the 1930s because they disturbed the viceroys and the viceroy's sleep when they come back from Simla. So they ordered the military secretary to the viceroy orders the NDMT to hire jackal shooters and report on a fortnightly basis about how many jackals they've shot on the ridge. The jackals were systematically destroyed. I mean, the numbers were amazing. The porcupines were destroyed. The foxes have disappeared. And, there are huge casualties. The jackals, by the way, are back. I call them peeping jacks. And I see them every day. I see them every single day when I go there. Because now they've become beggars along with the feral pigs and along with the macaques, which are fed by people who go and actually give them bananas and tomatoes and mangoes on a daily basis. But the jackals are back. And occasionally when you start to hear them calling, they respond to each other's calls. You get a wonderful sense of how many packs, how many pairs are actually calling. And they come from all over. So it's a wonderful sense to feel that, my God, the jackals are still there, which is wonderful. But yeah, so I think there is a kind of fauna that you do get in cities. Obviously, it's not the same as an unbroken large landscape that is completely wild, but it's a very important refuge for some animals. And then in places, like in Jodhpur, we created basically what is an island of 70 hectares of recreated wilderness inside a bustling city. And it's been amazing to watch the birds come back. I mean, we started with maybe 44 species of birds when we started counting them. And we didn't count them right at the beginning. It would have been even fewer because it was a pure landscape of prosperous juliflora. And we now we're topping 200, 202 or 203 species today. The birds, of course, can fly in and find the place and find the diversity of food that you get. And it's very interesting. When we started to remove the precipice in Jodhpur, for example, we were visited by somebody from the ZSI, the Zoological Survey of India. And he told us a very interesting thing. He said, how many species of termites do you think you have on your land? And I said, I don't really know, tell me. And he said, you probably have as many as 30 or 40 different species of termites. And they form the base of your food chain. And the more termites you have, the more birds and predatory insects you have, you will get an explosion of wildlife. So when we were removing the prosperous juliflora, all the thin scantlings, all the thin twigs and all kept left over that you can't sell for firewood, you would just scatter on the ground saying, yellow, this is for you, for the termites, And it worked, it just worked beautifully. So there are wonderful lessons to be learned about some of these things.
Pradip, the other kind of sense that one got when you were talking about the misunderstanding, the ecological misunderstanding of planting, is that this sense of the evergreen. The trees are green. I mean, when architects, when we draw them, we draw circles and shade them in green color, and have kind of fetishized it to a level where now we talk about green buildings, and everything has this connotation to it that is tied up by this color. But what you were describing was an ecology of a brown landscape, from the ground to the bark of trees and the grasses, the termites, all of that. I'd just like to kind of provoke you on this one, in terms of this other side of ecology, which is not green, and talks about other types of connections.
So when I was working on my book on Central India, the jungle tree, I was going in every month for sometimes a week, sometimes 10 days, but I wanted to follow the jungle through all its seasons and understand how it works, how it behaves. And I did this for almost 3 years. I did 36 field trips in all, spread over little over 3 years. And the more I understood and the more I noticed things, the more I was struck by how we haven't managed to bring in some of the most exciting aspects of what happens in a natural jungle, natural dry deciduous jungle into our cities. And I'll expand on that now. So, for example, one of the things that happens is that because all of them are ruled by the monsoon, which means that you have one big pulse of rain that typically starts around the end of June or early July, and then is gone by the first week of September. 90 to 95% of the rain falls all within this one period. So by the time January or February comes around, most of these trees are stressed because they've had no water since the first week of September. And they start to drop their leaves, much like trees do in a temperate forest, but they do that in autumn, before the onset of winter. But the reason is the same. When water is locked up as ice, it is no longer available to a tree. And here, water hasn't been available to a tree since September. So the dropping of leaves is a response to prolonged drought. Now, you would expect that if that is the case, that new leaves would only arrive when the rains return, right, in July. But that is not actually what happens. New leaves start arriving, in some cases, very early in April, and then through the month of April, through the month of May, and sometimes as late as July. Thank you. And this has been a puzzle to many people who've written about this or tried to understand it. They said that, they had to scratch their heads and say, how does this happen? Why is it that trees are putting on leaves when they do? And I've tried to answer this in my book, and I've got a chapter on seasons which talks specifically about this. And my understanding is like this. I've said that what's happening is that the only viable time for a wild tree to drop its seeds, drop ripe seeds in the ground, is just before the monsoon arrives, because there's no other time when it can hope for germination to happen, right? Which means that in some sense, metaphorically, a tree has to count backwards. By trial and error, it has to time its creating of ripe fruit in such a way that they ripen just before the monsoon. But because it takes differential amounts of time for flowers to be fertilized and for fruit to form, some fruit will take 14, 15 months to mature. The bale, for example, which is a hard woody fruit, takes 14 months for the fruit to actually mature. And there are succulent berries that take a few weeks. So trees need to count backwards from the monsoon to time to find the opportune moment to come into flower, such that the flowering process, the fertilization of the flower, the formation of the fruit, and the ripening of the seed happens just at the right moment. So that's why you get a cascading effect of flowering effect that happens starting in late February, sometimes early March, late March, all of it tied to this timeline. And new leaf is always either something that accompanies the flowering, or it happens immediately after the flowering. And my understanding of that is that because flowering is such an expensive business ecologically in terms of all the chemicals and the things that happen in flowering, the making of nectar, all the anthocyanins, all of that, trees can't afford to not power up with more energy. And that's why the leaves come out like sails, wanting their photons, wanting to photosynthesize again, and to give the tree another boost of energy because flowering has happened. So that determines when trees come into new leaf in the jungle. And it's happening in some cases 3 and 4 months before the monsoons actually happen. But this moment, Riaz, is such a beautiful moment in the jungle. And it's happening like the flowering in cascading effects that last 2 or 3 months. I have, long before I understood this, I would celebrate the fact that there are trees in Delhi like the Pilkhan, the Ficus virens, which is just delightful to watch coming into new leaves, because it's got these lovely pinks and bronzes and cerise and reds and dusty reds. I mean, you should take a photograph every day in front of a Pilkhan tree in Delhi. It'll be different every single day for something like 3 or 4 weeks while it's coming into this, settling into its green leaf. And I'm struck by the fact that our designers, our landscape architects, the people who, they've not understood this. They've not tried to bring this in. They've not tried to use these effects. And it's absolutely gorgeous. So for me, one of the things to celebrate about deciduous trees is the fact that you've got this epiphany when new leaves happen. So whenever I'm asked to design, I was asked to design a wall for a school once. And they said, give us flowering trees. And I said, look, don't go there. Flowers are ephemeral. Flowers come and go. Flowers will not last very long. Look at your foliage effect. Look at the way the foliage works with each other. If you have an interesting assembly of trees, you'll find that the textures and the sizes of leaves will work and bounce beautifully off each other. And the way the colors change works beautifully, So you've got wonderful, wonderful effects. I also try to understand why these trees grow red. And this is a bit of a diversion from answering your question, Riaz, but very interesting. The understanding used to be that the reason why you get the red, something like close to 90% of all the wild trees in the jungle go through a red phase when they first put on a new leaf. And the early understanding was that, look, they're all doing this at a very hot time of the year. And that being red is almost like some kind of infrared sunblock, protecting the leaf from the sun. This was soon discredited as a possible explanation. People then thought that, well, see, the reason why you see the reds and the yellows and the anthocyanins is because these are all essentially masked by chlorophyll. When chlorophyll is present, so in a temperate forest, like say a Canadian maple forest, what happens is that when autumn comes along, the chlorophyll is withdrawn. So the mask that is hiding these other colors, these other pigments in the leaf are being withdrawn, exposing the pigment. That's why you see them. And here the opposite is happening. The pigments are there first, and the tree is delaying the moment when chlorophyll is actually entering the leaf. And some people imagine that perhaps trees were doing this deliberately because the trees perhaps were only palatable when the chlorophyll was present. And therefore it was delaying the moment when the leaves are palatable to browsers. And this also was proved to be not the case, with the very simple argument that if this was true, then why was it doing it to leaves that are way out of reach of browsers as well? Why it would tend to do it only to the lower leaves. But the latest understanding, and this understanding is about 10 years old now, is that insects don't see in the long wavelength, in the red. So to be red is to be cryptic, to be hidden from your greatest predators, which are the beetles. So it's just a mind-bogglingly wonderful understanding of how beautifully nature works, right? But I'm very keen to work more and more with this idea when you plant in cities to actually bring in the reds, to bring in the those wonderful effects. And this is only one of several that I can talk about. Right?
Pradip, it's fascinating the way you're talking about it, because it seems that then to think about things as green is actually to make the environment static, to kind of, and the way that you've been talking about it is this extreme, I mean, to take into account seasons, the movement of of animals, all of these kind of shifts that are taking place. And I was just wondering that, in this kind of context, to kind of think about the way that we think about our gardens, let's say, the way that there's this kind of laissez-faire kind of lawn, the planting of lawns, the planting of certain species around the house, and as you said, which seem to have more an aesthetic and an ornamental intent. I was wondering what you thought, what you think the ecological consequences of this kind of landscaping, as we call it, is, and how that affects, let's say, the soil, the water issues that perhaps a city like Delhi has, pollution. I don't know how this whether there is a link between these things.
It's a huge subject. I could talk for a day about this. Yeah, but look, I identify 4 villains of the piece. One is the community of landscape architects who don't seem to understand plants or ecology. It's not their fault. They're not taught it in their school, I don't think. So they're great at plants. They're great at their little tree shapes and their features. But, I spend time with a few landscape architect friends, and I'm always nudging them towards, working more and more. And it works. Actually, it works very beautifully, at least in the few cases that I'm doing so. But I'm very, I find that the ruling aesthetic with landscape architecture in India today, and I'm not trying to tar every single person with the same brush, but the dominant aesthetic is the aesthetic that you see in all these airport schemes, which are basically derived from Sharjah and Dubai, and are all based on having evergreen palms and having drip irrigation and lawns, And to my mind, that's awful. We're at an awful moment, I think, with the way we create our celebrated landscapes of this kind. The other villain of the piece, I think, is the forest department, because the forest department ought to know a lot more about wild trees and about. I have a story that I tell about, in Pachmari, the national park there is called the Satpura National Park, and it's the most biodiverse park of any in central India, partly because there's such an altitudinal range in that park, and it's a beautiful place. And the national park was opened in 1981. And the first, I imagine that the first park director would have scratched his head and said, now, in order to, they had the ceremonial gate, and they said, in order to welcome visitors when they first go into the park, what can I plant as a little avenue that, at least for half a kilometer or so, gives them a sense that they're driving through a cared for space. So he probably used all his experience as a forester, everything he'd learned at the Forest Institute, to choose a tree to plant. And you know what he chose? He chose eucalyptus. Now, this to me speaks volumes about what is wrong with the way that foresters understand anything at all about forests and trees and wild space. I find it shocking. I'm angry about it when I see it. To think that a guy who's been to the FRI, who's been trained as a person who has to manage, a wild space, can only reach for a eucalyptus tree, in Central India's most biodiverse national park. It's really angry making. But wherever, I don't have obviously experience of meeting foresters everywhere, but I am familiar with Madhya Pradesh and Rajasthan and Haryana and certainly Delhi to some extent. But with a few shining exceptions, these are people who are completely opaque to everything that is vital and interesting and important to know about in the forest. So that's the other villain of the piece. The third is horticultural establishments, municipal horticultural establishments. And here I only have experience really of Delhi. I mean, the paucity of training, the lack of understanding, it's pathetic. It's really, really pathetic. And you can't expect more given the quality of people and the way they are trained. And I remember once working with a CPWD horticulturist, and I wanted to know, this was very early on when I was still learning my trees, and I took him to a particular tree in Shantivan where Nehru's Samadhi is, and I said, "What is this tree? Can you tell me?" He had been there for about 20 years. He said, "It's a Rudraksh hai." So I said, "No, it can't be Rudraksh because it's got a milky latex." And he said, "वो हम सब नहीं जानते हैं, हम सिर्फ जानते हैं कि Rudraksh." So then he called a Mali, one of the Chaudhry's over, and he said, "Chaudhry, साहब को बताओ ये कौन सा पेड़ है?" And Chaudhry said, "ये तो रुद्राक्ष है जी." तो मैंने कहा, "आपको किसने बताया?" इन्होंने बताया जी हमको. It was a very circular thing. But then he said the very interesting thing to me. He said, "साहब हम इतने deep में नहीं जाते, किसमें latex होता है, किसमें latex नहीं होता, family क्या होता है हम नहीं जानते, इतने deep में हम नहीं जाते हैं." I said, like saying, "You have to go that deep, yeah. If you're a horticulturist, you should bloody know about the history of art in our country. You should be somebody who knows your aesthetics. Otherwise, what can we expect of you?" When you go into, the West and you look at public landscaping and you look at private, you can almost not see a difference because these people are so beautifully acculturated and trained in these things. But here it's pathetic. And the fourth community I think that really needs reform is the nursery community, because they grow what they think is in demand, and poor landscape architects, when even if they want to plant native trees, say bhai kahan se milega, humko milega hi nahi. And the nursery people basically have, do you know that we have 2,600 species of native trees in this country? We use less than 2%. We use 50 or 60 trees in our parks and gardens and avenues. That's a shocking comment on us, I think, as a civilization, in terms of our curiosity, in terms of our interest in our natural flora. But surely, I mean, there are some interesting nurseries coming up in Pune. There are some interesting nurseries happening in Oroville, especially to do with their own biome, the dry evergreen biome. But until these four agencies can begin to pull together and ramp up their skill and their knowledge, they're going to be left in this very sorry state, right? So, yeah, sorry, I've lost my thread a little bit, Riaz. Will you remind me of what you want me to talk about here?
No, we were talking. I mean, you were talking about the four villains, but also we started off by talking about the way that private landscaping and the kind of laissez-faire attitude affects has ecological consequences. And
So the biggest ecological consequence that we have to be very, very careful about is what's going to do to our water resources, right? We are in danger, I think, of running out of water completely in Delhi and Gurgaon in the very near future. How much water can you divert, from the Himalaya and bring to this city and to the desert? It's crazy. I was very interested to read recently some documents that have to do with Southern California and the way they certify and allow landscapes to be permitted. And they are hugely conscious of water conservation. They actually have mapped the transpiration rate of all the plants that are used in landscaping in that region. They have transpiration budgets. They don't allow more than 10% areas of lawn because lawns are ecologically, so have such bad effects. So I guess it's only when we come to the precipice, that we will begin to suddenly say, maybe we should. Because the point is this, that if you have a thirsty tree, if you have a tree that is not perfectly attuned to that ecology, to that moisture regime, to that climate, you're going to have knock-on effects that are horrible. I mean, I see, just to take an extreme example, when you drive from Jodhpur to Jaisalmer, which is a drive I do very often, for the first 60 or 70 kilometers, there's some bhakt in Pali who has decided that he wants to plant 15 crore neem trees. So he's planted neem trees and put them into little cages, along this stretch. And then he has water tankers going and actually watering them every 3 or 4 days. And they're still miserable. And after that, even though you have these beautiful roads that are built by the border road people, you have no trees at all. Because it's never struck anybody that all the beautiful, the khejiris and the rohiras and the jars and, all these wonderful things that you see in the desert growing completely on their own, nobody's watering them, that they could just easily plant them along the roadside. So, I've had architects, senior architects in Delhi saying, we liked your book, but we don't like your emphasis on native trees. What is this native? What's wrong with exotic trees? And what is wrong with exotic trees is that, there are some exotic trees that are perhaps don't have that much wrong with them, especially when we reach out to Australian biomes, which are similar to us. And not all Australian biomes are similar. Those that have Mediterranean climates are not at all similar. But some that are basically have summer rains and are very dry, those trees will not require huge amounts of watering, but they may have other effects that we don't necessarily want. What native trees do is that if you are able to understand the exact right species for a particular biome, you get a tree that just is completely sustainable. And the word sustainable has become a bit degraded, but it's a very important concept. If you can have trees that sustain themselves without being constantly watered or given any kind of nutrition, you have a sustainable landscape. It's as simple as that. When we created Rao Jodha Park in Jodhpur, when they first invited me there, they said, can you green this space for us? And I said, yeah, but I need to understand from you what you mean by greening it. Do you mean that you have, lots of green lawns and park benches and flowering trees? And they said, yeah, that's exactly what we want. And I said, well, do you realize that you will have to, first of all, bring in several million tons of soil, literally, because this is a highly eroded volcanic rockscape with almost no soil. B, that you will have to water every single square foot of your landscape here every single day for the rest of your life. And then their eyes widened and they said, well, when you put it like that, maybe we don't want that kind of a landscape. But what is the alternative? And I said, the alternative is to go native, to try and restore the natural ecology of what rocky parts of the desert are like. And we'll have to go out and we'll have to find them. We'll have to understand them. And maybe there are differences between different kinds of rocky landscapes. Maybe rhyolite, which is what this is different from some of the sandstone ones or the ironstone ones, the ferruginous. So this is all something we have to begin. And that's how we did it. And today, we don't water anything here. We don't water. If we see a plant dying, we say, well, it's the wrong plant in the wrong place. Let it die. It needs to be replaced by something that's going to manage on its own. Because how can you look after 70 hectares of a desert landscape where you're actually going around and picking up the ones that need watering? You can't, And this concept, this idea needs to be applied, not just citywide, but I would say nationwide. And some of the commitments that the Indian government has made, to the Bonn Convention and things like that, they're talking about restoring 30 million hectares of forest, And my big fear is that I was on a webinar with some people who are talking about this, and the government actually provided some data, and they said, we already restored 10 million, nearly 10 million hectares. And I wanted to say, really? With what? With what species? And where? And in what soil? Because they know the forest department does not cultivate native species. They don't, typically they'll have 5 species or 6 species. They're only catering to demand. So how can the government have rewilded, restored nearly 10 million hectares without the knowledge, without the knowledge of ecology, without the species, without anything? So we're in a very, very frightening moment, I think, in this country on that score.
Pradip, there are questions from Professor Vasavada and from Prem. So I'm just going to open it up to the panel and also to some questions which are coming in from the participants. So Professor Vasavada, will you please join the conversation? Thank you.
Please do, yeah.
No, this is extremely fascinating. And I was just writing to you that let this phase get over. Because, I was a little bit trying to know, Pradip, your views on the Rajpath, the way it was planned and the way the changes are being made now. And there is also a kind of arboretum proposed. And I don't know what that would be, because knowing the kind of designs, which are coming up, one would wonder, what would happen with these kind of projects, So I just wanted to know, what are your thoughts on these?
So, my thoughts are not based on any plans that I've seen. There was an article in the Express, I think, a few weeks back that I responded to because I was very alarmed. And later, Mr. Bimal Patel said, that our horticulture team should never have spoken to the newspapers because it's premature. But in that first article, I think the one thing that they said was that we want to basically keep the original scheme, right, which is the Jamun trees. But many of them are aging and we would need to replace them. And then they also went on to say that essentially they listed the species that they said were part of the scheme along Rajpath. And they mentioned the bargat, the peeper, and what they called the wild fig. Now I was, lots of alarm bells went off in my head when I read this, because first of all, I don't remember seeing any bargats or peeper as part of the Rajpath scheme. And the wild fig that they were talking about would have probably have been a particular fig that you see right up. It forms the ceremonial avenue of the president's estate, and then it leaks out a little bit into where the North Block and South Block are, but it doesn't form part of the scheme for Rajpath itself. But I was also more worried about them saying they want to cut down the jamun and replant them, because it so happens that when I was writing my book way back in 2004, 2005, I was curious about these jamuns because, you're actually seeing several types of jamun. And sometimes when that happens, sometimes it means that you've got different ecotypes, types that actually are adapted to different ecological, microhabitats. But I spoke to a jamun seller, and he had recently, set up his data, his sheet under one of those Rajpath jamun trees that was selling the produce. And I said, tell me, are there differences between this jamun and some of the other jamuns that come in later? He said, हाँ साहब, इसको हम भदैया बोलते हैं, उसको हम आचार्या बोलते हैं, depends on when they ripen. And when I looked it up, I realized that actually they're completely different species, So it's not even Syzygium cumini, So if you'd gone to a nursery and said, "Mere ko jamun ke ped de do, I want to plant them on Rajpath," you would have ended up with the wrong species. So there's a lot of, when you have a lot of ignorance that is at the base of, a major scheme like this, it's very, very worrying. Now, when you ask me what should be done there, I don't really know. It's not something that I've pored over, but there's one or two principles I think that are important. One is that I think we have to get away from water-intensive schemes there. At the moment, those lawns are big enemy number one, I think, anywhere in this country. At the same time, you don't want to replace lawns with something that is going to be in any way inimical to lots of people being able to use these spaces. It's really important that, these are democratic spaces. They're spaces that are celebrated, especially by people who are not that well off and don't have their own gardens. So I think it's really important that somehow we find a way of retaining the publicness of these, of the avenue. With regard to what tree might possibly replace the jamun, I have lots of ideas, and these are, for example, a tree like the pilkhan, which I just think is just the most extraordinary tree that we have in the city. That that does more than anything else to celebrate spring in the way it comes into a new leaf and all of that. But the trouble about pilkhan, of course, is that in January, when they have the parade, it's not going to be looking that great. So these things have to be, thought about. Maybe there are some, and lots of people don't plant figs in cities because the roots tend to be, close to the surface. They push up surfaces and roads. But here it's not. It doesn't matter. You can actually think of figs that retain their leaves for longer. But the short answer to your question is, I don't have a ready-made answer, but I'm very worried about what Bimal Patel's team is likely to be doing, and I will certainly, send them any opinion that I have about what they might be doing wrong. Whether that is taken into consideration or not, I don't know.
Thank you. Thank you.
Prem, you had a question from Nina that maybe you would like to come in and ask. Hello, Nina.
Yeah, hi. I'm very much trying to bring in rewilding and some eco restoration in some of my built projects because I've also done ecological planning from from a CAG and I'm all of that sort of ilk. So my question is a lot of the stuff that you mentioned, I'm already in tune with. I had just some very simple sort of detailed questions. When we bring native trees into our landscapes, they do behave differently because they are in irrigated areas, and unless we can make that entire area completely self-sufficient and self-sustaining with no only rain-fed, what are your thoughts on just bringing trees into built landscapes, because they behave differently and they don't flower as profusely, or they don't behave the same way. So unless it's completely wild, what are your thoughts on bringing them into built landscapes?
So in an ideal sense, Nina, what you would need to do is have a process by which we try out trees. We have to trial trees, right? So look, we've got in my book about Central India, I have about 170 species of wild trees. I don't think that we'd want to garden with at least 30 or 40 of them, because they're not the kinds of trees that we would perhaps want in our spaces. But of the rest, we'd actually need to try them out in our cities. You're quite right. They don't behave in the same way because they don't have they're not in the same soil. The microbial life in the soil is not as rich. There's all kinds of things that are different, but we'd have to try them out. And we'll probably find that maybe there's 30–40% of them that actually don't take to captivity. They won't breed in captivity like you say about animals in zoos, right? But there are so many trees that we haven't even begun to try. This is the thing. There's a very interesting experiment that the British did in Delhi. So, I was talking about the avenue trees, and there are most of the trees that they tried out were very well-known trees. But in the case of 3 species in particular, they brought them in and they tended to interplant them with other trees. And I see this as being a little bit of tentativeness. They were not sure how the tree would do. They said, oh, look, we like the tree, but let's interplant it so that if it fails, we've got a backup, And one of these trees has become my favorite avenue tree in Delhi. But it's a tree called Hardwickia binata, the Anjan tree, which actually grows on the southern slopes of the Satpuras and then goes all the way south along the eastern Ghats. And it's an absolutely gorgeous tree. And it came in by, it came in tentatively with some British horticulturists perhaps saying, isko try karo, We don't have confidence that it will do well in Delhi. It's not from Delhi's biome. It doesn't have the same, it comes from rocky kind of habitat. So none of this experimentation has actually happened here, And I think that what we have to do is we can't just suddenly say, all right, let's just pick up, 60 trees and bring them there. We have to trial them out. We have to find out how they behave. And we have to evaluate them. The British used to have one brilliant feature in the way the arboriculture department works. They would have a 5-yearly report on how their trees are doing. If you're growing a tree, supposing I'm working in a department, I've grown a tree, I've watched it for the first 15 years. Things can happen to it after 15 years that are not anticipated. But you also need to pass this information and this knowledge and this experience on to people who join the department 10 years later or 20 years later because they haven't seen the beginning. So this passing on of information, this gaining of, trees live much longer than us. So if we just rely on one person's knowledge, you're only looking at a part of the lifetime of a tree. So none of this is in place. And I think it's very important to do that.
If I may, there is also not enough information that we can lay our hands on communities of plants. I mean, what goes with what and how do they make that, that ecosystem, and that community kind of, you can plant a tree which is native, but what shrub goes with it, what ground cover goes with it, and how do you sort of combine them to replicate nature? I mean, we can't make nature, but how can we just make it in such a way that it'll all hang together? So we don't have much information on that. Have you done any work on that?
That's a very important point, Nina, very important point, because so what I tell people who come to me and say, how do we do this, how do we do that? Essentially what I'm saying is, look, you have to find a model of wild space that has the same coordinates in terms of moisture regime, soil. You have to test the soil carefully. And then you have to look and understand very carefully how communities work. So you're actually looking and understanding and taking information from a living wild space. If you do that, that's how you learn. Because you're quite right, the information is not out there. What you have is, you have floras for practically the whole country. Floras are lists arranged phylogenetically of how botanists think plants have evolved from simpler ones to more complex ones to more advanced ones. But there's almost no ecological information out there. So maybe one should include another community, Riaz, in the people who need to step up, and that is the ecologists who study plants, because they don't look enough at at being able to map ecologies at a ground level and at a minute level. But your point is very well taken.
If I can ask a question, sorry to hog this mic, but William Cronon in his book Uncommon Ground says that we've socialized an imagination of nature where we respect it in wilderness, but in the city, we reduce it to an aesthetic spectacle we can manipulate. And he argues that we have to inculcate a gaze that looks at the weed that grows in the pavement crack, the shrub that seeds itself in my backyard, the tree on the street, and see it with the same wonder with which one sees the primal forest. Now you've been clearly infected with that wonder. I was wondering if you had any suggestions about how we could institutionalize that at wider scale in our systems of education.
Oh, I don't know
If I
how
may
to
add,
institution. Yeah, sure.
No, there were some similar questions related to how, whether this should be introduced, native species awareness and weeds, etc. Knowledge of this should be introduced at a school level. This was one of also the questions by the attendees. So, sorry.
No,
Sorry for
I had
that.
no idea how to institutionalize it, but I'm now, before the lockdown, I planned to spend I've given up all my rewilding work, by the way. I'm not doing any landscape work at all anymore because I want to write, because I think that by writing, I can communicate to a wider audience. And I wanted to write about the work we've done, and also to do more, sort of field guidey work in Western Rajasthan. But because of the lockdown, I wasn't able to go to the desert. So I've now invented a whole new writing project for myself. And I find myself almost breathless with excitement because I'm looking at the Central Ridge in Delhi, 850, I'm not covering the whole area, but I'm, one particular area that I visit is probably 30, 40 hectares. It's a highly degraded forest. It's full of invasives. It's full of what are called weeds. It's full of things like 3 species of cacti which don't belong there. But I've decided that what I want to do is I want to now write a book that celebrates everything that is there, whether it's a snake or a jackal or a feral pig or a mosquito or a plant. And I want to be able to share that in a way that is just, that is infectious. It's not going to be an academic book. It's going to be, and I want to do it digitally. I want to do it with videos, and I want to be able to add to it as I discover new things later. And I'm hoping that the way the book is also consumed is that if you buy a book, you can upload to your book things that you see and find, almost like finding a feather and putting it into a book, into a journal that you like, So I think that we're at the beginning of, we're in the early stages of celebrating nature in this country, and I have some very small numbers. I see an explosion, a relative explosion of field guides happening to dragonflies, to birds, to insects, to mammals, to trees, to shrubs. If you look back 15 years, there was none of it, except for Salim Ali's book on birds. There was almost nothing, So I guess it's a rolling ball that will slowly, grow bigger and bigger. But yeah, in terms of teaching it, absolutely. I mean, I think that we really have very, very poor heuristic attitudes to what children can learn and experience and understand. So the more the merrier on that front. Yeah. But to rewild, you can rewild at any scale. You can rewild your backyard. You can rewild your terrace roof. And it's always very rewarding. So this business of what are called, they call them ruderals, right? They call weeds. The polite name for weeds is ruderals. I just recently somebody sent me a document that he'd prepared for one particular walk along a street in Edinburgh. And he just photographed and described the history of each one of those ruderal weeds, And it's now been celebrated in Edinburgh as this wonderful new document that is giving people all kinds of. I was very pleased to see. I visited London after many years, about 2 years ago, and wherever you look at a roundabout, and it's got lank grass, 3 feet tall, bursting with little wildflowers and things that are coming in a completely regimented way. You go to Kew Gardens and the grass is taller and then a huge patch. There's a whole new thinking now that is happening there that is the opposite of what is happening in Sharjah and Dubai. And I hope landscape architects open their eyes here and begin to see that.
Pradip, Sudipto has a question, and I'll ask him to put on his video and ask it. Sudipto, join in.
Yeah, I didn't have Edgar DeMello is with us, and he had a question.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Sorry. Edgar, welcome to the panel and to the talks. Please go ahead and ask the question that you have.
Hello.
I can hear you.
Yes, Edgar, we can hear you.
Okay, right. As an architect, one is constantly being concerned about this paradox, between afforestation and the problems we have on the cards elsewhere, and this constant need of timber as a building material. I don't know whether, you could shed some light on the one hand, whether they are sort of indigenous of the land sort of strategies where they use as much as they need, and if they need more, they grow. As against in the urban areas where we just consume without any thought. So are there strategies in place where there is a forestation plan specifically for, let's say, the building industry? Like they have, I hear, in Scandinavia and in Japan, because ours is such a huge construction industry. Is there anything in place as far as allowing trees to grow and having to cut them?
So very briefly, basically when we started forestry work in this country, you're asking about this country, right? You're asking about whether there's stuff in place here. But they started working
in the south of India, we use a lot of timber, in Kerala, the coast, and things like that.
Yeah. So when forestry work began in India in the mid 19th century, the British didn't really have a tradition of scientific forestry. They certainly had no schools or anything like that in their country, right? And they invited Germans to come in because the Germans and the French both were fairly advanced, at least for about 50 or 60 years, they'd had forestry schools and things. And so the first Inspector General of Forest in India was a man called Dietrich Brandis, and he was followed by Ribbentrop and various other Germanic names. So you can see that the German philosophy of how to treat a forest became very, very important to how they saw it. And the German system is called a high forestry system. Right? What a high forestry basically means is that you get rid of all the trees that are of no direct economic use to man. You treat them as waste, and you plant up forested areas only with those species that are regarded as being of economic value, and you grow them, in rotation, even age rotation, and you cut them according to this rotation. And that's how you get what's called an incremental stock of wood, and you cut a little bit less than the growing increment each year. And that's basically how all our forests, not all our forests, but all our growing forests, the wood forests have been managed. And we continue to do this, even though there's been some lip service paid to various conservation ways of doing this. But the short answer to your question is that, we don't really have a system that works. We've destroyed a lot of diverse mixed deciduous forests and made them into monocultures. If you look at Germany today, there's a frightening statistic. Germany has 91% of its forest species forest trees consist of 7 species, and 3 of them are exotic. Only 4 species make up, 90% of Germany's forest. That's what would have happened here as well. When I was working on Central India on the books there, I would often, be reading a British book from, let's say, the 1890s or the 1880s, talking about a diverse forest. And I'd go there and I'd find it's just been converted into a teak monoculture, or a shisha monoculture. So we're doing tremendous damage to our forest. Our forest, our forest policy, our forest department, our forest training, FRI, they're in a complete mess. So I'm sorry, I have a very, very, that kind of answer.
I thought so. Thank you.
Pradip, we've been on for an hour and 40 minutes, so I think we'll wind down a little bit and just end with one last question, which ties up a few of the questions that have come in from the attendees as well. And this is one that goes back both to your film, but also to your experiences in the forests of Panchmari, and which when you spoke about, you talked about the communities of the forest as well, people who kind of, in some sense, have traditionally lived with the forest. One of the questions from the attendees is about your learnings from these communities. And the broader question is whether when we start looking at trees in their individual characteristics, whether we lose these kind of possibilities of having communities engage with the larger forest, so to say, in any kind of meaningful way. So I'd just like you to respond, and we can close after this.
Okay, so learn by using communities in two senses. You have communities of trees and communities of people. Is that
the tribal communities of the forest?
Okay,
the people,
right.
The people, yes.
No, so what I learned from the tribal communities was not any kind of formal, principles of categorizing them or recognizing them. They have a very instinctive, I mean, obviously there's some learning involved, but they have a very wonderful sense in which they're in touch with everything. And they know the things that actually impact their lives in any way. You probably find that there are some plants that they know are kind of either dangerous or don't have any hold any meanings for them, and then they got to stay away from them. But because so much of their lives are lived, in nature and outdoors, and because they use so much of what's around them, even while they tread lightly, on the ground, they have a very beautiful relationship with nature, and with which is certain in a sense, because the minute they begin to change, or because of a change of either change in technology or change in new animals coming in or new kinds of animal husbandry, suddenly the meaning of their place in nature actually begins to change. What did I learn from them? I learned a lot about, let me give you one example. There's a man called Baldev who lived in our village, and we were very friendly with him, and we would say to Baldev, aaj aap humko aam khilao. So Panchmari happens to be one of those places where you actually get the true wild mango. There are only very few places left in India now where the mango is truly wild. And these are small mangoes, about so big, very fibrous. It doesn't have a kind of clean flesh, but they taste quite interestingly. And the Adivasi community there makes a lot of money collecting them and selling them as mangoes for the pickle industry to banyas in the town. And we'd say, Baldev, humko aaj aam khilao, and he'd take us walking through the jungle, passing all these trees that had mangoes. And we'd say, well, why not? He said, no, let me take you to one special tree. And he'd take me to one particular tree that he'd have a name for. And he said, isko kha ke dekho. Then we'd try it, and we'd have, being small, you could actually, and then being chusnis, you could actually have 4 or 5 or 6 of them. And we'd say, fantastic, brother, this is wonderful. He'd say, हाँ, इस पेड़ का नाम ये है. Then he'd say, और खाना? And we'd say, हाँ. We'd say, कैसे खाना? Do you want it slightly more khatta? Do you want it slightly more meetha? Do you want, what is the taste you want? And we'd describe it to him. And he'd walk us for another half a kilometer through the jungle, passing all these trees laden with mangoes and saying, no, no, not this one, not this one, not this one, to another tree. And for the first time, we realized that, my God, trees are also individuals. They're not just a species, you know. I mean, one mango tree is not like another mango tree, that they all have a character and they produce fruits that are, you know, completely individual. So it is a wonderful lesson in understanding these things. He's also the guy who actually taught me to touch a tree to get to, you know, to establish a relationship with it. And this may sound a bit new age, but I don't do it in a new age, you know, spirit. I do it because there's a wonderful, I don't know, I just feel a tactile sense of, you know, getting to know a tree. But I also want to say something that I haven't talked about before, just very briefly, Riyaz. And that is that, you know, I often feel that we are so 10 years down the line, 15 years down the line, we're going to smile at what at all that we didn't know today, you know. We're only beginning. I mean, you know, people like Wallaben in his book, The Hidden Life of Trees, you know, is talking about mycorrhiza and things like that, which are basically only 15, 20 years old, this understanding that there are ways in which trees actually communicate, you know, underground using fungal networks. So we call it the World Wide Web, right? And then they're now talking about, you know, chemical signaling that is released even when you have a browser card. But these are all things that we're beginning to understand, you know, the ways in which scientists are now actually mapping what happens within individual plants is revolutionizing an understanding of how plants work. And I think that we are still in a fog of huge ignorance that will slowly clear over the next 10 or 15 years when we know much more about this wonderful community that we know as nature and its plants. It's a good note to end on.
Yeah, it's thank you. It's wonderful. It's been wonderful this morning with you, and thank you for sharing the wonder of trees and ecology and your experiences with us, and particularly the engagement and the embodiedness of a life around this love. It's very generous of you to spend this time and share with us. Thank you so much, and once again,
thank you.
We look forward. And we look forward to you joining the rest of the talks wherever you are interested. Thank you, Pradip.
I will. Thank you.